Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Stride for the Love of Running webinar series here a little bit earlier than we normally record because we have another fantastic guest. As always, my name is Evan. I'm joined by Mikael Eriksson. How are you doing today?
I'm doing fine. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I want to peel back the layers here a little bit too. We've actually spoken before, and I've been on your show, That Triathlon Show, before. So we have some rapport there, but we're super excited to have you on our side today to hear more about you and everything. Scientific triathlon, all that stuff. I'm really, really excited to give people more of a look into the coaching side, your specific style of training and coaching and stuff. Before we get started, I want to ask anybody watching live right now, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. If you're watching on YouTube or Facebook, producer Gus behind the scenes will send them along to us. And also on top of that, please feel free to subscribe and give the stream a like. It helps out a lot. I have an introduction here for you, but before we get started, do you want to tell us anything about yourself, just so people know a little bit more about you?
Well, just I guess the 10,000-foot overview is that I'm from Finland. My native language is Swedish. I'm a Swedish-speaking Finn. I live in Portugal, and I'm a triathlon coach. So that is my main sport that I work in. But I do come from a running background originally, even though not a super competitive background like you, but more coming in it from the recreational side of things.
Yeah, and I was perusing your website a bit ago, and you listed the languages you speak, and I really liked. You said you speak a bit of French, but it's constantly deteriorating or something like that.
Yeah, it's my Portuguese is the one that's improving, obviously, living here, and French is deteriorating. I used to speak that a fair bit. I lived in Switzerland for half a year, but awesome. That's now long gone.
Yeah, what's been your favorite place that you've lived, or favorite place that you've, I guess, stayed at for an extended period of time, because you're a world traveler and very experienced with different locales in the world?
Yeah, I mean, Lisbon, definitely. I moved here with just my bike bag and 2 additional bags, never having visited Portugal, and that was 2.5 years ago.
Wow.
And I'm still here, and I'm planning on being here for a long time. So
wow, what's the specific draw for you?
It's got a bit of everything. It's a beautiful city. It's got a really good vibe to it. You have great training opportunities, great climate, but it's not maybe as touristy as something like Barcelona, which was another option that I was considering, even though it's getting there, I guess.
Right. Awesome. Yeah, well, that's super cool to hear. Let me run through a quick intro, and then we'll get into things. Like I said, I'm really excited to talk to you, because I've listened to quite a bit of your shows. The people that you have on, specifically your podcast, and you feature on the website, I think it's a ton of great information that you've been able to take in, and a ton of great people that you've been able to talk to. But yeah, let me run through an intro really quick. So you're the founder and head coach of Scientific Triathlon. You have a master's in engineering from Helsinki University of Technology. You're a 2-time 70.3 World Championship qualifier, and you have had an 8th place finish at the 2018 Finnish Olympic Distance National Championships. You host That Triathlon Show, which I think the name is probably one of the most original names out there. And you interview guests from all over the endurance community. Like I mentioned, I tune in and I listen. I have had the pleasure of being on the show, which I really, really appreciated. But you've had a ton of great guests on for that. So anybody watching now, if you have not already listened to and you don't already follow, we'll put links down in the description, as well in the show notes for the audio form of the podcast as well. Anything I missed in that intro, or any other things you wanted to mention off the top?
No, that was a great overview. Just one thing that I would mention is that even though the podcast is That Triathlon Show, I do have a lot of listeners that are pure runners, pure cyclists, even rowers, kayakers, and the like, because it's really an endurance sports podcast. And there are so many overlapping elements to all endurance sports that I do get tons of feedback from people that are not triathletes at all that find the podcast valuable. So for the runners listening, that's something that I would like to mention.
Absolutely. I've talked to a couple different triathlon people in the past, and I think it's really funny. The phrase I like to use is that I don't consider myself a triathlete, but I do activities in a triathlon. So I can swim, I can bike. I've been picking up biking more recently, but I run as well. So what do you think about that statement for people like you mentioned, runners listening? They might not consider themselves triathletes, but they absolutely can still incorporate some of those activities into their training regimen.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are a lot of running coaches or even triathlon coaches that also coach runners that do use those disciplines to basically just increase the volume of aerobic training that you can do, because running is the one that tends to come with the most risk of injury.
Absolutely.
And like a perfect example would be Meb Keflezighi, who used a lot of the elliptigo, even though that's not cycling or swimming, but you could argue that he could also probably have added a lot of cycling volume as the complementary training volume to his running to not get injured, but also get in the amount of volume needed to have success later on in his career as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That sparks an interesting thought. If there had to be a fourth sport added to make it a quadrathlon, what would be a fourth sport that you feel like would be worthy to add in, and what would that order be?
Oh, wow, that's a really good question. I mean, you have in adventure racing and stuff, you have things like kayaking, but you also have pentathlon where you have shooting and stuff. So it could be anything. If I could choose, I mean, given my football background, maybe it would have something to do with football, because then I would be at a competitive advantage.
Sure. Oh, so is this American football, or is it football
European,
everywhere else in the
soccer,
world?
European football.
Soccer. What about something like you mentioned the obstacle course thing? What about climbing? Would that be like an interesting addition?
Although, yeah, it would be interesting. I would definitely watch that. I would probably not do so much with myself.
Right. Absolutely. Cool. Well, enough, discussion, I guess, about the fourth event to be added to triathlon. Let's get into some of the topics we have here. And I do want to remind people, if they're watching live, please feel free to ask any questions that you have during, and they will be sent our way. First topic we have here is specifically looking at the coaching side of things. So the main kind of driving topic is, what are the most valuable resources for coaches or someone interested in self-coaching? So to start things off, can you tell people how you got, let's flip it, how you got your start as an athlete yourself? Because all athletes at one time or another, I imagine, think that they can coach themselves. They want to take their training into their own hands. So can you tell us a little bit about how you got started as an athlete yourself?
Yeah, so as a kid, I grew up playing football, as I said, European football, and I was always very active in general, skiing in the winters and stuff when there was snow, being out on the ice when there was ice, all sorts of things. But in terms of endurance sports, so that was until I started university at 19. And then I was doing a bit of running. I actually ran my first marathon when I was 17 as a bit of a competitive thing, because my friend had done it the year before. Didn't really train for it, and I wasn't very fast. I just got a sub 4 hours, so not at all talented per se. But then when I started university and stopped football, I still wanted to keep relatively fit and healthy with all the partying and stuff going on. I took up running more as definitely on a recreational level, but eventually after a couple of years I got into it more and more and became more consistent, and also funnily enough got faster and started to be more competitive and enjoy that sort of process of improvement. So my start in endurance sports was in running. I started, by the time I got to my third marathon, I think I really started reading about it, because I was doing my engineering degree, really interested in science, and I started reading books like Daniel's Running Formula and Advanced Marathoning by Pete Fitzinger, which were basically, those were the triggers for my interest in the science of endurance sport. And from there it just snowballed on, and started reading more and more and learning more and more. And then I got a running injury, of course. So that's maybe a bit of a bias to my answer to the previous question, that yes, you can do cross training very well as a runner and benefit from it.
Totally.
But yeah, I started doing that. It was a bit of a chronic injury. I started swimming and biking, and then once I eventually got back to starting to add running back in, I had already done my first sprint triathlons, and without run training, but just getting through the races, and then there was no turning back. Basically, I kept doing triathlon because I found that I enjoyed the variety of it so much.
Right. Interesting kind of progression there. I think when you talk about getting into running as somebody that was inexperienced with like training, what was, if you can remember back, what was your mindset and approach to training before you started reading the different running books out there and approaching things from that engineering side?
Yeah, that's a really good question because I haven't thought about that, never really reflected on it. To be honest, I don't think I was somebody who always went out and tried to smash every single run. I just never really, I guess, took too much, cared too much about. I just went out and ran and let the legs sort of decide the pace. And probably what ended up happening, I would guess, is that I always ended up running sort of in the sort of a tempo zone. That would be my guess.
Right. Do you remember your first pair of running shoes specifically? You said, I'm going to buy these shoes for the specific purpose of running.
No, I don't remember that. No.
Yeah, too many pairs over the years,
yeah.
right? I think that that comment that you made there is something that we've heard a lot from people that start out running. It seems like everybody comes with the mindset that until you learn more about training and you have those like hard efforts that are scheduled in, you don't really balance training. You just run at that threshold-ish area, that moderate running all the time. So it's very interesting to hear that a lot of people arrive on the same point without really talking about it necessarily. So after you took a little bit of inspiration from the different books that you read, the different experts that you listened to, what were some of the first points, if you can remember, that started influencing your own training? Was there anything that stuck out to you, whether that's periodized training or the concept of like a threshold, or you need a longer run and then some shorter runs as well? Do you remember anything that just stuck out in your mind that kind of inspired you to look more into training?
I think that one big influence on me early on was definitely Advanced Marathoning by Pete Fitzinger, and I did follow those programs, and I did enjoy those programs. I still think I actually just revisited the updated edition of that book, and I still think that those programs are absolutely great. I would definitely be confident in recommending them to anybody who just wants a canned program. I think, it's pretty simple. It's not rocket science. It's consistency. It's a lot of volume, to be honest. The long run, if we're talking about marathon running, is extremely important. And then there is a fair amount of threshold running in there, which I do think has a place. I'm definitely not somebody who poo-poos tempo or threshold running. I think it has a big place in endurance sports. But also there is a mix of more high-intensity VO2 max intervals in there. So it's simple, but it works. It doesn't have to be complicated.
Right. And so once you started looking into more and more of these different methods from different coaches, did that kind of inspire you to go down the road of coaching other people? Or what is your progression from being an athlete look like to becoming a coach?
Yeah, so it started with running when I was still running, and that was just a couple of friends and family members basically that I did that I wrote programs for, and when they had a race coming up, so that's sort of how it started. And then it started with a couple of them. I also started more in terms of not formal, but a bit more on the coaching aspect of actually not just writing a program, but getting in and having conversations about how to execute the training and so on. But it was on the running side. It was very informal, although it was a period that probably lasted for 2 or 3 years from the very start of it to when I stopped running or started focusing on triathlon coaching. And the triathlon coaching, I guess I took up once I was a little bit further along in my triathlon career, although it didn't take me that long, I guess maybe 3 years, 2 years actually into starting triathlon, because by then I was just devouring all information on endurance sports that I could get my hands on, and like going to courses and things like that. So I think 2 years into my triathlon career, once I felt that I also understood the sport from an athletic point myself, even though I was still very much improving at a rapid rate and nowhere near like my own athletic potential. But I felt that I understood the sport pretty well. And that's when I started coaching. And it was a bit more formal at that point. And then pretty soon after that, I started the podcast, That Triathlon Show. And from there, that's when sort of the really formal aspect started with scientific triathlon, and coaching eventually turned into a full-time job in October 2017. Or actually August or September 2017. So coming up on pretty soon 3 years of full-time coaching.
Wow, that's amazing. And I imagine the time has gone by very quick. For specifically coaching, being involved in other people's training, it seems like there's always that next goal ahead or that next tweak you have to make. I want to ask you a little bit about what got you into triathlons, specifically about your own development from, like you mentioned, you had a chronic running injury and you added more cross training in, but what was if you can remember and recall, what was the first kind of drive to try a triathlon?
I had actually done an Olympic triathlon earlier as in my late teenage years. And that was with a wetsuit that was made for surfing or something, so you couldn't really move your arms in it properly.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And on a bike that was like a city bike essentially, and not at all fitted to me. It was a fun experience,
right.
But very painful actually at the end. But then as I got into running more seriously, I still always had in the back of my mind that at some point, once I'm like tired of this running thing, I'm going to try triathlon. So it was in the back of my mind for quite a long time. And then I guess the injury just made me it took the decision of when to transition for me rather than me taking the decision myself. But fortunately, that injury is way behind me now, and it hasn't caused any more issues in a long time.
That's awesome. What was the hardest part about the triathlon that you had, like either the training or the racing? What was the hardest thing that you had no idea was a thing, like the thing that you just realized once you started training for triathlon, like the most difficult aspect or something unexpected about it?
Yeah, I don't know if it's unexpected, but swimming, learning to swim, the proper technique is definitely not easy. That's a pretty evident answer, but it was true for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like that's that thing, especially right now. We've had people like Bobby McGee on the show talk about adapting swimming technique and swimming training. Especially right now, swimming is one of those things that if you don't have access to a pool, don't have convenient access to open water and stuff like that, it seems like that's one of the biggest barriers for triathletes right now. And we're going to touch on that a little bit later in the show. I wanted to ask a kind of follow-up on both of yourself as an athlete and coaching. What have you learned as an athlete yourself since you started coaching? I imagine you work with a ton of different athletes from a ton of different backgrounds that are all in unique situations. Have you learned anything that you've applied to yourself or kind of internalized to yourself since you started coaching?
Yeah, I really love this question. I think it's a really good one. The most important thing I've learned is to focus on the big picture. And by that, I mean, I don't get hung up on one or a few bad workouts, but I also don't get very excited about a couple of fantastic workouts. I only tend to I try to only allow myself to get excited if I put in like months and months of really solid training. And it doesn't have to be spectacular training. It just has to be solid training. That's when I try to get excited, not for those hero workouts.
Right.
And another thing that I definitely learned is that I'm much more risk averse than what I used to be. I still don't think that as an athlete I'm risk averse enough, which is why I also have a coach. I have a triathlon coach, or it's one of the reasons. But even if I was coaching myself, I would be more risk averse than I used to be, but probably not enough. And to give an example of something that is a bit more specific in terms of training, I guess, rather than more of like the high level, I definitely have gained a greater appreciation for the importance of building a really strong aerobic base and also how to do that.
How I want to touch on two sort of practical examples of that maybe then. So you talked about the concept of no hero workouts. So a lot of stuff I like to think about my own training is I'll be completely satisfied if there's like, a B- or a C+ workout, if it's like a graded workout, right? Instead of an A or an F workout. So can you talk a little bit about a practical example, how you might be risk averse to doing one of these hero workouts and what that kind of might look like in a practical training example?
Yeah, so well, in my coaching, it's a great example because even though I prescribe paces and powers and heart rates, not so much heart rates for the high intensity workouts, but I always will give the athlete an indication of how the workout should feel, and generally I just tell them, so we're looking for a session RPE on a scale of 1 to 10 of whatever,
Right.
and you will always never see me, or you will never see me give, like, we're looking for a session RPE of 10. The highest I will go to is a 9. Obviously, when we're doing specific performance testing or we're doing races, then you will get a 10 probably, and that's the way it should be.
Right.
But in workouts, I always want the athlete to feel that they could have done one more rep, or even just gone a little bit further of the whatever tempo run they were doing. It's not they could do another 40 minutes at tempo, but just gone 50 minutes instead of 40 or whatever.
Right. Do you think that that's something that people could benefit from if they're a self-coached athlete or an athlete just following a training plan, of having a coach that prescribes more risk-adverse things? So like we talked about, for people getting into running from the very beginning, a lot of people run very hard, that tempo effort. Some people do try and run as fast as they possibly can for as long as they possibly can. Is that something that a coach could potentially help with for an athlete if they are pushing the limits all the time in their current training?
Yeah, definitely. Because I think that for most athletes, the window that they're looking at in terms of their training is 1 week at most, maybe 2 weeks.
Right.
But it's not the whole year. Like, you can ask an athlete how many hours are training, and they will answer the weekly amount of hours that they're training usually. And it might be the highest amount of weekly hours that they have ever trained, or like at least recently trained. But if you ask an athlete how many hours are you training per year, I would say that less than 5% can give you that answer.
Yeah.
And a coach will know that it doesn't matter so much what you do this week and next week. If you have constant ups and downs, and your overall yearly training hours is just going to be disrupted because you are putting yourself into holes and you need extended recovery, or you get injured or something like that, it's much more important to focus on long-term consistency and over years accumulate that volume of training.
Totally. Something I kind of want to follow up on that is, like we mentioned, a lot of runners, will be listening to this, some triathletes as well. I feel like more triathletes are familiar with the concept of training time and the density of just overall training time, because you can split it between 3 sports. You might be able to add some elliptigo in there or something as well. But for runners, a lot of runners are very regimented in mileage, or tracking their miles or kilometers per week and only looking at distance covered. Something I like to look at specifically from a stride point of view is like the running stress score thing that we have. I find that pretty eye-opening, especially because we're out here in the mountains. If I'm doing a hard up and down run, it will be much, much different compared to just regular distance. Can you explain how somebody might be able to track their duration and what they should look for in terms of progression? There are things to pay attention to if they're a runner, or maybe, even like why you might prescribe training and look at overall training density in terms of like hours.
Yeah, it's, I think that mileage also has value. You can basically, if your training follows a similar pattern week in, week out, then it's not that different to track mileage compared to tracking hours for a runner, because it will almost, like, your average pace will be more or less the same. Obviously, over time you will get fitter and your average pace will improve. But let's say you do 1 tempo workout per week, and then maybe you do a faster interval workout, and then you do 4 or 5 easy runs. Then overall your weekly structure looks the same. So whether you're tracking how many hours you increase by over a given time period, or how many kilometers or miles you increase by, it's all the same. It's still just a percentage improvement. So I'm not against using miles, and in some cases I actually have used miles specifically rather than hours, especially when I have had athletes that have needed to build up for a marathon on a short turnaround time. And then I find that, yes, I will, with that athlete in particular, an example that I'm thinking of, because he's an advanced athlete, a really fast runner, a 2:32 runner on the marathon, we will definitely increase his running hours more than would be advisable in most cases, or that short time period. But I tracked kilometers, just to because I wanted to have a bit of a cap of how many kilometers he would be running, because essentially kilometers would be more, it would be representative of how many strides and how many times of he gets a repetitive impact force through his body. So there's advantages of that as well. But for triathletes, I think that definitely makes sense to track hours, because as you said, you have the different sports, so you can look at them separately, but you can also aggregate them, and you can, because how much you increase your cycling volume, and that will be counted as hours usually, is also going to impact how much, if any, you can increase or change your running volume, and so on and so forth. And for the pure runners, I do think that the advantage of tracking hours is that you don't get hung up on how many kilometers a much faster runner than yourself are doing. Right. So that's a big advantage.
Right.
If you don't have any ego, then you can absolutely use mileage, and it's going to be just as effective. But the problem is for a lot of athletes that they're looking at how many miles or how many kilometers are other athletes doing. And that's when you get into this mindset of trying to do more and more miles. But if you're actually looking at your hours, you might be much closer to the weekly hours that somebody else is doing, and that will make you happy. Whereas looking at the kilometers or miles will make you disappointed, and you will be probably or maybe doing too much and increasing the risk of injury.
Totally, yeah. One of my college coaches said, I can get anybody on this campus to run 70 miles a week. Like anybody literally can run 70 miles a week, but like you have to have a specific talent to be able to run 5 times 1 kilometer repeat in 3 flat with a minute rest and be able to go do it again. Right. And so it's the stuff inside that makes up that training too, which I definitely agree with the points you mentioned there. Last kind of question in this topic that I'm really curious about too. You mentioned some of the books that you have really taken a liking to on your own progression as an athlete into a coach. What are some resources you value to educate yourself more about coaching athletes now in the current frame? So what are some resources that you really key on and use?
Yeah, by far my most important resource is other coaches, having conversations with other coaches. And probably the most important ones are the ones that I have with the other coaches at Scientific Triathlon, Lucky, James, and David, and also my own coach, David Tilbury Davis. So those are the ones that I communicate with on a very regular basis, and I always learn something when I talk with any one of them. And within Scientific Triathlon, we specifically organize meetings where we try to further each our own development and discuss around specific topics.
Do you feel like you're always learning then, if you have like these sounding boards of other coaches that are dealing with all these different athletes and different experiences and stuff?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think it's also a great way to identify any potential biases that may be developing within you, and you can sort of get a feel for where you might be making assumptions that are not necessarily correct.
Can you think of anything like specific that you potentially or somebody else had like a bias that after talking to somebody you maybe thought of things in a different way? Like, can you give us an example of talking to another coach that opened your eyes, or you were like, oh my gosh, yes, eureka, this is it?
Off the top of my head, I mean, there are many instances when that has happened.
Yeah.
I guess very recently, so actually just a couple of days ago, we had a conversation about swimming within our coaching group and swim training, and some of the things we discussed there around use of intensity in swimming definitely was pretty eye-opening, and around training intensity distributions, and how sometimes like maybe I have overestimated how much we can apply training intensity distributions that typically are seen in cycling and running to swimming, and that might not be ideal for swimming, and that swimming programs that are highly successful actually can sometimes follow very different structures.
Yeah. I don't know. Are you familiar with like American runner from way back in the day? His name's Jim Ryan.
Yeah.
So like this is really interesting. It sparks kind of a follow-up there. His high school track coach was a swimming coach as well, and just basically did swim training but revised for running. So it seems like sometimes they can cross and work out, but for a lot of people, I imagine doing like 40 times 400 repeats with a minute rest or something like that is probably not going to be conducive unless you want to break 4 in the mile in a high school race. But it's very, very interesting. There any other resources or anything else that you value just as a coach and educating yourself more about coaching athletes?
Yeah, well, researchgate.net, because that's where you can usually find research papers, and you can find a lot of them in full with the entire PDF, not just the abstract. So that's a great resource, probably my number one favorite if we're looking at a tangible resource rather than other people.
Sure.
So that's a great one. Also, Endurance Training is a book by Inigo Mujica, a textbook kind of that applies to all different disciplines of endurance training, really, really good. And Science of Running by Steve Magnus is another great one.
Did you read his follow-up book? I think he's had 1 or 2 since he published the Science of Running book.
So I read his second
Passion Paradox, I think.
Yeah, that's the one. That's the one I haven't read. But Peak Performance. Peak Performance is the one that he. So yeah, I did read that, and that's also great. I really love it. But it's maybe not as much for coaching, although you could argue that it is. But it's not physiology.
Right. Totally. I remember when that Science of Running book first came out. It was like you open it and it's like, wow, this is very, very thorough and very different if you're used to, I guess, table formats and VDOT stuff from Jack Daniels and some other stuff. So very, very interesting approach. I think that actually transitions really, really well into the next topic we had here, which was what process do you use to scientifically refine your own training, especially with the ongoing pandemic? And this is your training as well as coaching. So your name of coaching service website is Scientific Triathlon. And that might sound like too technical for some people. It might lead a lot of people to ask, like, oh, what scientific methods and approaches do you use? So can you explain just a little bit more about that side of some of the processes that you use that are kind of based in science?
Yeah, and that name, to be honest, I didn't think it through a lot when I bought the domain name. So that's a bit of an issue, I guess, but the name has stuck.
Yeah,
because you're completely right. It does give an impression that, well, that's the only thing that matters, and obviously it's not. So the way I see it, like there's definitely like you need the scientific knowledge or an understanding of training, exercise science, and physiology to be able to really understand why you are prescribing training the way you are. That being said, there are coaches that maybe don't understand it, but they just practically from experience know what works.
Right.
And I think that that's also an equally valuable skill to have. So that's just as important a pillar of how to coach somebody, in my opinion. The experience or the sort of the anecdotal evidence and basically trying to distinguish patterns in how an athlete is developing. Although I also try to be cautious about not trying to see patterns where there are none, because that's a very good skill that we humans have to see patterns where there are none.
Exactly.
But that being said, the anecdotal knowledge that has been gathered as a coach yourself or just through talking with other coaches is also equally important. And then I think that just the athletes themselves, they are such an important part of the puzzle. Like if you're coaching somebody, you need to have a conversation with them.
Right.
Just creating a program for somebody is not complete coaching. So that's really like you can ask an athlete, like, and you can see from their workout comments how they are adapting to training and what's working and what's not working. And basically it becomes a blend of all, like, many different inputs. Yes, you have the scientific and exercise physiological underpinnings of how, like, certain things that we know generally how they work, but then you also need to adapt things based on the interaction with the athlete. But also you might not always need to know that there is a specific scientific reason for prescribing a particular type of training. Sometimes you just have a gut feeling that it might work, or you know that some other coaches have used it to great success, or you yourself have done that. Then because science is always lagging behind what's actually happening in the real world, there's nothing wrong with using those sorts of things if you think that there is a good probability that it might work. But I guess I think that you need to basically know why you're prescribing something and make a trade-off between one option and another, and based on some criteria you have for yourself, just make the decision on what might be the best thing to do in this particular situation.
I've heard the phrase, some people refer to coaching as more of a art than a science. Do you have any thought about that, specifically just with, like we talked about, resources that you use yourself to educate with about specific training intensities or stuff like that, but then talking about coaching as, like you mentioned, you see how your athletes are entering comments and adapting to training and actually like feeling the training out. So any comments on coaching being an art on top of a science?
Yeah, I think it's both. I don't think it's more an art than a science, and I don't think it's necessarily more science than art. I think it's both. And I mean, you could argue that if you know the science behind communication really, really well, you could definitely like read into a lot of the things in terms of body language of athletes and what words they're using in their workout comments. So that can maybe be seen as an art, but actually there is probably a lot of science behind that too. So I'm not too familiar with that myself, but I'm sure there is. Yeah. So it's both. It's both.
Awesome. One question here is, how frequently do you revise your training protocols or know when it's time to make a change? And this can be for yourself as an athlete, as well as the different, things you prescribe to athletes that you coach.
Yeah. So for myself, I don't do it because I'm coach now. So that's great. I don't need to worry about that. For my athletes, so if I understand the question correctly, so I mean, there's one aspect of it, which is how long are the blocks that you're planning at a time. So that generally ranges from 3 weeks, sometimes 4 weeks, but definitely not in pandemic times when things are changing rapidly. Now it's more like 3 weeks at a maximum, but it's been mostly 1 to 2 week blocks at a time for most of my athletes, depending on where they are and what the situation is like. But then there's also like behind the scenes having a bit of a macro structure of what you want to achieve within the season, what types of training you want to do. And that's something that I do at the beginning of the season when we get the races. And then basically based on how the athlete is developing, I might reassess that. It's not something that I have in the calendar that every month I go and readjust it, but it's on an as needed basis. And definitely with all of my athletes, the COVID-19 pandemic has made it necessary to go and readjust that macro structure as well. So that's, again, more of an as needed basis. And for athletes where everything is going really well, they're developing really well, I just keep following the structure that I planned at the start of the year at a high level. But for athletes that maybe start to stagnate, or they have changes in race plans or something else come up, then we might need to readjust that once or twice or 3 times per season or more even. Yeah,
I think that's a great transition to the next question we had too, is given the pandemic and the current state of things, how do you adjust the training with no races on the calendar? Or if somebody had a race on the calendar and it suddenly gets canceled or postponed, what are just some of the general things you go through in terms of adjusting?
So, I mean, the first step is to have a conversation with each athlete about what their particular situation is and how work is changing, family life is changing, even risk of infection where they are, that sort of thing. Obviously, restrictions like pools and gyms and so on. But then also just their motivation, their mental status at this point in time. Like, do they actually want to keep pushing? Are they still motivated to improve as an athlete? Or do they feel like actually there are more important things going on and it's a good time to take a bit of a step back and just go into maintenance mode? For some athletes, that's the case. And for others, it's not. For others, they keep wanting to improve as normal. So that's the first step to establish those goals with each individual athletes. And then some of my athletes, what we've come up with is basically do some interesting events or goals that they have for themselves. It might be a solo time trial. It might be just a group of friends going out and doing a race or doing an Everesting attempt or something like that. Those have all happened And it might just be something as simple as we keep doing some sort of formal testing, like a 20-minute bike test or a 5K on the track on a fairly regular basis, and we want to keep seeing improvements. So it all depends on what the athlete wants, but I do think that generally with the athletes that I coach, most of them are in a position where we are actually just targeting to keep improving on the bike and the run because the pools have been closed.
Totally.
And it's not, I don't believe in that. So there are no races. Now you just go back and do long, slow distance. That's not something that I think is necessary at all. And I don't think that's something that you should do in a normal season either when you go into off season. Right. But what I do think is that now that we have no races and we don't know when the race is happening, it really doesn't, the trade-off isn't worth it to train at 100% of your capacity.
Right.
So I'm trying to instill a mindset of we're trying to train at slightly below the maximum training load that you could sustain, and training at 90% capacity rather than 100%, even if you want to improve. Because that way you can train at 90% for months and months, if that's what it takes, if races are going to be canceled for a long time or postponed. But if you train at 100%, in 4 weeks, you're probably going to have to take like a much bigger reduction in training load because you can only sustain that for so long. And yes, while you might get a short-term boost, long-term, I think that the impact of doing really consistent training week in, week out, and it can be seen as boring and monotonous. But I think that that's really how you can use this time if your goal is to really improve your performance by doing that sort of consistent training week in, week out, month in, month out, and making sure that you don't take the training load way too high is important. But it should be fairly high, of course, because otherwise you won't improve.
Right. I think that's a great, actually probably answer this next line of question we had here is what do you feel is the biggest thing athletes can do to take advantage of the current situation? And you mentioned training at a submaximal training load. Is there anything that you've been recommending to athletes to kind of like change their mindset about saying, no, this is great, this is going to play into your advantage? Is there any sort of training changes, training regimen that you prescribed your athletes to help them take advantage of the current situation? Maybe no access to gym, no access to pool. What are some of the things that you've done with specifically your athletes?
Yeah, I think that some athletes definitely have needed that sort of something on the calendar, so we can put in their calendar that on this day you're going to go out and do a 90-kilometer bike time trial or a marathon with your friends, or an Everesting attempt, or you're going to do a 5K on the track or something like that. So that's something that has added motivation. But then for others, it's more like, yes, while we want to keep that consistent training, and if you want to improve, a lot of the training actually still should be structured. That's important, but it doesn't have to be day in, day out necessarily. Like if you want to every once in a while exchange your structured bike workout for just a ride out, if you are allowed to ride outdoors, where you just go out and smell the roses, so to say, that's totally fine, because you're not preparing for a race in the very immediate future. So having a balance between the structure and focus, I guess, and just enjoyable training, and that's different. Some athletes might need to do that once per month, and some need to do it twice per week, and we adapt it to the individual athlete.
Is there a methodology or a mindset that you recommend to your athletes while you're doing this testing? So testing, doing time trials, these harder efforts as kind of checks during training is vitally, vitally important. Is there specific things that you recommend for athletes heading in? How do you maybe prescribe goals? What do you look for afterwards? What do you ask the athletes to pay attention during? What's your kind of mindset around that?
Yeah, so I generally advise athletes to try not to be nervous, because it's not the race. This is a part of how we optimally prepare you for the race. Right. But still, yes, they should obviously like to get up-to-date training zones and targets and so on. We need to get a 100% effort out of them. So they should see it as something that they really that they really put an all-out effort into. Right. But then the result isn't a grade. They're not graded on it. It's just about a process, I guess. Like if you, for let's say a 20-minute bike test, So that's 1200 seconds, right? So you have to spend 1200 seconds where every single second you're basically working as hard as you can, and take it second by second. Don't worry about what the power is. Just make sure that by the end of that 1200 seconds, you're not able to sprint or anything. You've laid it all out there. Then you passed with flying colors, and then we see what the power is. And if the power was great, then there's reason to be happy about that. But don't equally, we don't get overly excited because it's just one workout, 1 day in training. So as I said, it's still months and months of solid training that is the thing to really get excited about. And same thing, if it's bad, again, just 1 day, a snapshot. But definitely, if the result isn't what we expected, then I, as a coach, has a responsibility to try to figure out why that is. Was it just an off day, or is there something that needs to change? But that's not the athlete's problem necessarily, although we need to have a conversation about it to figure out everything that might be going on. But I guess the mindset is to just focus on the process and be present in each given second and do your best in that given second, but don't worry about the outcome so much.
What is, so peeling back the layers again a little bit here, what is your specific training approach? Can you tell us a little bit about how you design training? And something we were talking about before we started recording was differentiating data-driven training from scientific training, and just your general thoughts on those concepts. So maybe you don't have to reveal all the secrets, give us the recipe book and all that stuff. But maybe talk a little bit more about how you specifically approach training, and then some of the methodologies that you use.
Yeah, there are absolutely no secrets. So I don't believe there are any secrets in endurance sports. It's fairly simple. Like Eliud Kipchoge's programs can be found on Sweat Elite, and but the question isn't what's the program. The question is, well, can you follow it and can you adapt to it? So anyway, I mean, I'm a big believer in building a strong aerobic base, as I said, and I think that's something that you can't really shortcut. It takes time. It takes a lot of hours of training, and it's not over months even. It's over years if you really want to get to your potential. So I think that it's a long-term project if you want to really get to your potential as an endurance athlete. And also I'm completely honest about the fact that if you only have a certain amount of hours per week to train, then you might never reach your full athletic potential, because there is a certain amount of volume that's needed. You can't completely exchange aerobic volume for intensity and expect to get the same results, because the best athletes, they do both. They have a high volume and they do some targeted intensity. So but that's really the foundation of training, is that base endurance training. So in a 5-zone model, a lot of training in zone 2, even zone 1, depending on how much the athlete is training. Athletes that are training at a high level and at a high volume, they might benefit from more from zone 1 training. But for athletes that are in terms of triathlete, let's say below 10 to 12 hours per week, they generally don't do that much zone 1 training. It's more zone 2 training across the board for them. So that's really the number one. But then also the second important part is to have higher intensity workouts in there. And I think that over the course of an entire year, you want to have basically a bit of all sorts of higher intensity. So in terms of running, for example, tempo run is a familiar concept. Zone 3 training, threshold training, kind of zone 4, and you have VO2 max training, if you want to call it that, zone 5. So having workouts in each of those zones, targeting each of those, I think is beneficial over the course of the year. And then there are various reasons for how you might want to, how much you want to do of each of them. An Ironman athlete, I would probably have focused more on the zone 3 type of work than zone 5, whereas a sprint distance athlete might be doing a bit more of the zone 5, not necessarily more of the zone 5 work than zone 3, but definitely compared to the Ironman athlete, they will have a larger amount of training in zone 5 and zone 4 than the Ironman athlete. I do think that one thing that I'm also using is that sort of tempo training is partially part of the aerobic foundation. I find it's really useful training, but I think that it's often done at too hard intensities, if you want to use it like that, and you ending up more in like threshold territory, and then it's easy to just accumulate too much fatigue. Right. So, and I think that, I mean, specificity is important when you are approaching a race. Then you need to do some specific training, but you also need to train things like in triathlon, for example, in Ironman, it's super important to train your ability to tolerate taking in a lot of carbohydrate for like a full day out on the race course. There are many more things, and feel free to jump in anywhere you want, and I can explain more, but that's at a high level an overview.
Yeah. One sort of thing, I guess, whenever I hear the concept of threshold, tempo, zone, a lot of coaches, depending on who they are, might use the terms interchangeably, but they might assign those terms, specifically tempo, threshold, or zone, with different things based on their education, people that they've talked to and stuff. So when you say something like zone 5, what is that specific sort of intensity, or can you clue people in a little bit more about what you break down as sort of zone training, and why that might be an approach that somebody might be able to use for success?
Yeah, so zone 5, you're right. I mean, these are just tools that we use to communicate with the athletes, and there's not necessarily a right or wrong system that you can use. Everybody can use their own different system, and as long as the athlete understands what the coach wants to prescribe, then we're all fine, and it doesn't really matter whether you call it zone 5 or zone 3 or zone 7.5.
Sure.
But for me, zone 5, like generally, I mean, it's a bit wider than that, but when I prescribe intervals in zone 5, they tend to be sort of 5K to 3K race pace, if we're talking about running. So something that an example workout would be to do 12 by 400 at 3K race pace with 60 to 90 second recoveries.
Interesting. Yeah, I think that's great definition there.
And just to elaborate on that, so
sure.
If on the other hand we do a workout like 4 by a mile, then that might be at most 5K pace probably, or maybe even a little bit slower than 5K pace. It's still a zone 5 workout, but just because the repetitions are so much longer, we end up in a little bit of a different spot in that zone.
Right. Super interesting. We had 2 questions trickle in that I want to make sure that we answer here from some of the listeners. This first question comes from Terry. It says, in general, how does the age of a triathlete, especially those 60 and over, influence training plans?
Yeah, so I mean, a couple of things. I think the primary thing that influence training, if we're talking coaching, not training plans, not just canned plans, then I mean, I treat everybody as an individual. So there are 60-year-olds that can train way more than 25-year-olds can. As an example, one of the coaches in Scientific Triathlon, Laki, he coaches a 60-year-old cyclist in Switzerland who he bikes 25 to 30 hours every single week. He's super fit. His VO2 max is 69 or something like that. So, I mean, it's not like age is just a number. Like we have to coach the individual. Like you can't just apply I guess, generic 60-year-old plan to that athlete who is obviously much fitter than normal.
Right.
But a couple of things that I tend to want to do with aging athletes is definitely strength training, including some heavy strength training. I think is super important to try to retain lean muscle mass. And I mean, if we're talking about like average rather than individualization, yes, on average, older athletes might need a bit more recovery between hard sessions. That is true. But again, I think that it's so individual that you can't say that a 30-year-old athlete needs this amount of recovery and a 60-year-old athlete needs another amount of recovery. It's completely individual.
Right.
And but then in addition to the strength training, I also do think that older athletes, a lot of the time, just to try to counteract that decline of VO2 max that we see with age, my older athletes tend to do a little bit more of that zone 5 training rather than like for their quality training, just to maintain that. And it's something, I can't even remember who said it or where I heard it, but I do think it's true to an extent that if you have a 20-year-old male, you can get them super fit by just having them do 30 hours of training per week in zone 2. You don't need to do much or any intensity.
Sure.
But on the other side of the coin, if you have like females, especially like an older female athlete, with them you might want to go a bit to the other side. Like you don't want to do too much volume, but intensity remains very important. But again, intensity remains important with the caveat that you need to have enough recovery between sessions.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that's a great all-encompassing answer. Second question here is from Patrick. As a coach of endurance athletes in the extreme, how do you prevent and or recognize parasympathetic overtraining? Could also be of interest to self-coach athletes. So is that something that you look at? Is that parasympathetic overtraining?
Yeah, I do think that HRV is a great tool, and specifically if you have a decline in your baseline or your rolling average of HRV, so a decline over time in your HRV score, that can be used to identify that. You can also use an increase in morning resting heart rate. That's also can be a sign of parasympathetic overtraining. And also actually like very low heart rate in your workouts and an inability to reach a high heart rate during high intensity, for example, can be a sign of that.
Interesting. And is that something that, I mean, obviously, as you're reviewing athletes' sessions, if they're making some comments and then you notice their data is following this certain trend, is that something that you incorporate into your system just to give yourself a little bit more information about that?
Yes, yeah, definitely. And I think that's what you said there is spot on. Like if you see from a workout or you hear from a comment in a workout that, well, this workout didn't go to plan, then I try to figure out why did this happen. Maybe the athlete commented that, well, I didn't sleep well tonight. Okay, then that's likely the answer. But if we have, especially like the way I see it generally is that I'm not too concerned at all if an athlete has one bad workout, two bad workouts. I probably get a bit more concerned than I should, to be honest, because I still don't think the two makes a trend. But if they have 3 bad workouts in a row, and we're talking here the sort of more higher intensity workout, so or it could be just an endurance workout that feels super hard for some reason, but that is rarely the case. I mean, I almost never see it happen. So the way where these things start to manifest is generally first in the higher intensity, the harder, more challenging workouts. And if an athlete has 3 of those in a row or in a pretty short time window, like within 2 weeks, more than half of the workouts that they do are quite bad, like they don't achieve the goal, that's really when I try to dig deep and look at HRV in detail and resting heart rate in detail, if that is something that the athlete measures. The first thing to do is still to just ask the athletes how they're feeling and try to dig a little bit deeper through a conversation. But definitely heart rate and heart rate variability can be helpful in that regard.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that's great feedback for there. We're nearing the hour mark, and I want to make sure I get these last couple questions in here. Specifically, switching gears and talking about your running media, endurance media experience. You've had, like I mentioned, a ton of great people on That Triathlon Show. Who is the most exciting person, or can you list a couple people that you've had on your podcast that you found really exciting and really, really interesting?
Yeah, I was thinking about this. Thank you for sending the questions in advance because these will be difficult to answer on the spot.
Sure.
Definitely, my own coach, David Tilbury Davis, is one, and also the other coaches in Scientific Triathlon, as I mentioned. But then in addition to them, the ones that come to mind as my favorite interviews probably that I have done are Dan Lorang, who, for those that are not familiar, is the coach of Jan Frodeno and Anne Haugen. Both of those won the Ironman World Championships for the men and female side in 2019. Then we have Adil Tveiten, who is the Norwegian triathlon head coach. And the Norwegians are having great success. And as a small nation, not traditionally a triathlon nation, that is really, really impressive. And he has been on twice and great interviews. And finally, Joel Filiol, he's one of the most successful triathlon coaches of all time, coaches a ton of world champions, both the men's and women's world champions on the ITU circuit, the Olympic distance, are coached by Joel Filiol, as well as many of the other best athletes in the world. And it would be almost a shock if he doesn't have at least a couple of Olympic medals when the Olympics go ahead.
Yeah, who's somebody that you'd really love to get on the show that you haven't yet?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I have a list of that somewhere.
Yeah.
Off the top of my head. Oh God, this is a difficult one to answer.
Sure.
Yeah,
Great
if anybody comes to me, I will let you know. But
Awesome.
for now, I can't think of anybody.
Second to last question here. What would you like to see more of in the endurance media world? Is there anything that you think should start to be a trend? Is there anything that you're really interested in specifically on the endurance media side?
Well, I think that that's why I started my podcast in the first place, because I think a lot of the endurance media was focused, especially back then, but still is to some extent, focused on talking with athletes and is more story driven than education driven. Sure. Whereas what I try to do with That Triathlon Show is definitely the goal is education and talking with coaches, and I would like to see, there are now definitely more media around that than there used to be, and that is great, but I would like to see that trend continue and have more and more increase with coaches and also to some extent scientists and researchers about how to improve your training rather than just the stories of how an athlete, how they felt during the race. That is the typical question, right, that you see on TV. How did it feel?
And then they're just finished a 400 or something. They're still breathing super hard, and they say, "Yeah, it was good."
Yeah. I want to hear the reporter ask, "What was your training leading into this?"
Exactly. Last question I have from my side is: can you tell us what the concept or the word sisu is? I think I pronounced that.
It's sisu.
Yeah,
Finnish is a weird language. Yeah, it's how do I explain it? It's basically, I guess you could say grit almost. Yeah, but it's a kind of grit that you need to survive in minus 20 degrees Celsius, and that's basically the origin of it.
Awesome, cool. Yeah, that was the one Finnish word I feel like I knew. My dad was a runner in the 70s when Lassivieren was incredibly popular and stuff, and that was one of the things that he told me about when I started running, was to have that grit, that internalized mental fortitude and stuff like that. Yeah. Well, that was all of our questions. Can you tell us where people can find out more information about you on either social media, or give one more plug for your show and your site?
Yeah, it's scientifictriathlon.com is the hub for everything. You can find everything from there, the podcast. And but if you're searching for the podcast in your podcast player app or on Spotify or wherever, then it's called That Triathlon Show. And that's 2 episodes per week, Mondays and Thursdays every single week.
And I would definitely encourage people, if you are interested in any of the episodes you hear, the website has probably the best presentation of topics and things talked about during the show that I've seen from any sort of podcast out there. It is so incredibly helpful to have those bulleted points and kind of the timestamps of when things are talked about, just to help people remember that stuff. So if anybody listens to it, visit the website and take a look at the specific kind of listing out of all the topics. I think that's so incredibly helpful. So that's one of the big reasons that I visit the site, is because it's so helpful to listen, but also kind of follow along to the subjects too. Yeah, well, I got to give a big shout out to Rasmus, who creates the show notes from the podcast, and Sam, who used to do it before him. So big thanks to those 2 people, because I could not do that myself. Yeah, awesome, cool. Well, thanks so much for coming on. We really do appreciate it. This wraps up this Stride for the Love of Running webinar series. We'll be back with another episode next week. Mikael, any plans for the near future for you? Just keep training, I guess, and keep coaching and training, and let's see. I hope that the pools will open soon. I'm actually looking forward to my first open water swim of the year this weekend. So, awesome. But nothing too exciting. But I'm very happy with just coaching and training day in, day out. It's like a perfect life, I think. So I don't need anything other than that to be very happy. And I imagine you got a newer swimmer or based wetsuit compared to the surfing one that you saw. Oh, yes. Yeah. Awesome. Cool. Well, thanks so much for coming on again. We really do appreciate it. We'll be back with another episode next week. See ya. Thank you.